The following Predator Watch podcast is sponsored by SurvivorSupport.net. We're told that the trans movement is all about inclusion and sensitivity toward those who are the most vulnerable, toward those who don't fit into normal sex stereotypes, toward those who've been involved in alternative lifestyles. In fact, we're told it's the most tolerant of all groups of people and has within it people who can be relied upon to be safe people and provide safe spaces for those who are gender confused. Is that really true? Well, behind those carefully crafted talking points and PR spin, there's a very different world going on behind the scenes for those who truly were gender-confused kids, for those who even went through the foster care system through no fault of their own.
Right. Yeah. And especially somebody like me, okay, because they know my background. Okay. So they know that I was in, foster homes and stuff, and that I came out into the adult world, this wounded creature, right? So they know that I've got this background, and they're supposed to be all about toleration, love, and inclusion, right? And they showered me with intolerance, hatred, and exclusion, stripped me of my identity. So that tells you that they're not really about those things. They're about control or controlling the narrative and pushing an agenda.
Jenn Smith, a genuine and legitimate transgender who is sounding the alarm over vulnerable, gender-confused kids being subjected to transgender medicine, will join us next on Survivor Support's Predator Watch podcast.
Predator Watch provides a brief overview of important stories in the news or issues of concern as they relate to understanding the nature of sexual predators, their characteristics, how their minds operate, their methods of manipulation, and what motivates them. They hide in plain sight, can smell an opportunity a mile away, and count on people not understanding just how dark their hearts are and how intent they are about always producing victims. Stay tuned as John Mueller, a licensed professional counselor with over 25 years of professional experience treating both survivors and sexual predators, shares his insights on this edition of Predator Watch.
Hi, and I'm John Mueller, and you're listening to the Predator Watch podcast. Well, I am John Mueller, and thank you for joining us on the Survivor Support's Predator Watch podcast. With me on the other end of the line is someone I have the utmost admiration for. It's Jenn Smith. Jenn is a transgender identified, I'm going to say a champion of kids that have found themselves gender confused. And I'm very, very appreciative of your time and your willingness to come on the podcast.
Well, you're certainly more than welcome, and I'm happy to be on the show.
Well, and you are not new to the idea of podcasting. You have your own podcast. Let me have you give a plug for your podcast right now.
Right. Anybody who goes to YouTube, and if they just search for Agenda, Jenn Smith, and Agenda is spelled like my name. So it's AJENNDA, Agenda, Jenn Smith on YouTube. That will bring up my show. And if you subscribe to it, then you'll get notifications about when I'm doing my broadcasts.
There you go. And you have a live broadcast that you typically do on the weekends or on Sundays, Pacific Standard Time. Yeah. But you have... You've come to the forefront in this fight against the medical transitioning of kids. I think that's how I happened upon you, and you and I sort of, at least from my perspective, kind of had heard of one another. You really, in my estimation, are on the forefront of this. You're sort of the tip of the spear. And so I'm late in the game. You, understandably, because of what you have been addressing, you have to be very mindful of who you're interacting with. But you were willing to start to review some of my things, the things that I had been speaking about and posting online. And somehow you ended up kind of giving me thumbs up, and then we began to interact, and then we did some interviews from you to me on your podcast. And so wanted to have you on my podcast to let people know that, you know what, it's not enough to have sentimental thoughts about this issue, or I should say concerns without doing anything. And Jenn, you have found yourself in the middle of this whole fight. Do you want to chronicle for us kind of two things? How did you find yourself in this fight? And it really is a fight. You have done yourself no service. You're not getting a lot of accolades. So how did you come to where you're at now as far as fighting this? And then also, why don't you kind of set some context about your background and how it kind of manifests itself in your concern for these kids. So what are you doing now, and how did you come to do that? And then what caused this to be a burning concern for you?
Well, I mean, I have basically, we'll say, played with transgender identity since I was a child. I first began experimenting with it when I was 9 or 10 years old. But I sort of grew up at a time when being transgender was not okay. I grew up in the interior of British Columbia. I was a foster child, so I went through 6 different homes, and this sort of the fact that I was a foster child has played a big role in what I'm doing now. But I went through 6 different homes, but all of those homes were sort of old school Christian homes. And in that context, in the 70s and 80s in British Columbia, anybody, let alone a kid, expressing as the opposite gender, that was not okay. Okay, that was, at that time, that was considered a sign of either mental illness or sexual perversion, or both if you were talking about adults. People won't like to hear that today, but that's just the reality. That's just the way it was. So I had sort of psychological, emotional issues as a child, and felt rejected by the whole world, as you can imagine many foster children would. And so in one of the homes that I was in, I had a much older, super pretty foster sister, right? She was, popular with everybody. She had all kinds of male friends, all kinds of female friends, this whole entourage that followed her around. And she seemed to me to be living this perfect life and seemed to walk around in a bubble of positive energy all the time. And I, who was not only, had this sense of rejection, but I also was viciously bullied in school because I was sort of a weird, emotional kid. And, the bullies in school picked up on that. And I was also the youngest and smallest in my class too. So I was having very bad experiences. I would say that even my experiences in school were worse than my experiences in the homes that I went through. So this kind of sort of negativity that I was immersed in at that time, when I compared that to her, it was like, wow, why couldn't that be my life? And that's when I started playing with cross-gender expression. I started putting on her skirts and putting on makeup and pretending I was the super popular foster sister, right? And I sort of became obsessed on this. And this is one of my ideas about what is happening with kids, is that it tends to be kids who have OCD tendencies and kids who are prone to flights of wild imagination and obsession. And that was me, okay? So I locked in on this idea and I began obsessing on it. And I actually began going out around town and walking around town like this, right?
What age were you when that happened?
I didn't keep a diary or anything, so I can only guess, right? Because I never thought that I'd ever be talking about this, but I'm going to guess I was about 9, maybe 9 or 10, something like that.
So elementary school age.
Yes. Very young. And when I was walking around town and stuff, I was doing this only when I thought like my foster parents would know or nobody would know. I was just like doing little commando transgender raids into the street and stuff, and I thought I would get away with it.
That's good. I've never heard it put that way.
Right. So I came back from one of these jaunts around town one day, and my foster father was home, right? And he was making a sandwich or something. And he's a World War II veteran, a Christian, 1970s, late 70s. And when he turned around and looked at me, it was like, okay, what the heck is this, right? So at that time, he sort of, after being shocked, he sort of told me that this was, inappropriate behavior. It was dangerous behavior, first of all, that who knows what would happen to me out in the streets walking around like that. Second of all, he said, listen, you're a boy. You are not a girl. Don't do this anymore. So it was made very clear to me at that time by not only the families that I was living with, but with society in general, that this was not acceptable behaviors. This is actively and I would say aggressively dissuaded from this behavior. Now, I continued to play with it because, again, that obsessive compulsive nature, but I didn't really come out with sort of expressing this way more openly in the public until I was a young man. And then even then I kind of went back and forth, and my story is just so complicated I couldn't possibly get into all the nuances. The point is I was in and out of the closet, in and out, and by the time I moved to the lower mainland of British Columbia by the city of Vancouver, which is a very metropolitan liberal city, right, then I sort of was able to start expressing myself in a more open way once I got out of certain situations. Again, that gets into the complications, but I think this back and forth identity for me and the fact that I was held back was actually good because it forced me to remain tethered to physical reality. Okay, society itself and everybody around me forced me to concede that I'm a male first and foremost, right? So I could go on to sort of express any way that I want in terms of how I dress or makeup or whatever, but I was forced to concede I was male, and I think that is a good thing because I never sort of went off on to puberty blockers and synthetic hormones and who knows, Lord forbid, some sort of genital surgery or something like that. I never went down that route. So I'm a big believer in there are doctors out there who would call this the watchful waiting strategy, right? Sort of trying to assess whether or not a child really is transgender. But I'm like a little further beyond that. So I believe that not just with kids, but with adults, the starting ground for your identity or the starting place for your identity should be truth and a recognition of physical reality and the fact that if you were born male, you are male, you will always be male. How you want to express into the world is quite another question, but the starting point has to be truth. So that I was forced to do that. And because I was a troubled youth and had psychological, emotional troubles for much of my particularly early years as a young man, I sort of ended up getting into transgender sex work and got involved in that. And that got me into even deeper levels of this and connected me extensively to what I'll call the underground transgender sex community, right?
Jenn, can you tell us what age approximately?
Well, I got into that when I was in my early 20s. And I was sort of, I would say, lured into that by some people who were sort of in that sort of what we'll call bisexual LGBTQ underground community.
As a matter of fact, do you mind going into that a little bit? Because my contention is that for those who have found themselves in alternative lifestyles, especially for men, my contention is that because they have, you either have the aggressor or predator or those being preyed upon. And pornography plays a tremendous role in both. For the predators, they never try to stop. And in fact, my contention is nothing really happened to them. They are just men that became deviant, and the further into deviance they got, it'll manifest itself in different ways. What are your thoughts about what I just said? And then how do you think that may have played a part? Because I think that's crucial for people to understand, especially for guys that end up going into, you called it sex work, some will call it prostitution, whatever label you want to put on it. Because when I was working in the prison on the psych staff, we had a number of guys that were transgender that I would say are legitimate in the sense that they would never harm a child, they would never sexualize a child, but they were busted in one way or another connected to prostitution.
Right. Well, so first of all, and I have to be careful with the language here because I am always getting into public sparring matches with leaders of the LGBTQ community locally. So I have to be very careful on how I phrase things. But it should be understood, I think, that within the, particularly the gay community, and when I was growing up, when I was a young, so tween, right? There were no women who were trying to lure me sexually. Okay, there were, and I encountered at least two gay males who were, probably in their 30s. I don't even know how old they were, who began sort of seeing me as this wayward, lost, wild creature that they could lure into their lair, right? And they did, and they used drugs to sort of lure me in, and they began sort of gently, making sexual allusions and giving me sexual ideas, and began talking about how, whether or not I was gay or not, because I remember the one guy said, because I'm gay, I just want you to know that I'm gay. So if you're gay, you need to know that it's okay to tell me, right? So they sort of worked my mind at that point and sort of began sort of giving me what I'll call positive sort of sexual feedback. And as a very wounded, rejected youth, this sort of positive feedback kind of like at first was sort of kind of alarming to me, because the first time that I was lured that way, I was basically drawn into a house with two much older, much larger men. And here they are sort of giving me sexual, sexual come-ons and ideas and stuff at a time when, being openly gay still wasn't really considered appropriate, certainly within the Christian community, right? So I was kind of alarmed at first, but they kind of,
and that's part of the grooming process,
right? Yeah. So there is this element within the gay community who, and I wouldn't say like the whole pedophile thing's another question. These were what you would call how they pronounce it, hebephiles, right? So they were attracted to pubescent young males who are just coming into their sexuality. It's like they're just coming into their sexuality, so they have some sort of kinky sort of attraction to being able to sort of explore that aspect of a young male, right? So there are those elements within the gay community, and I encountered them. I only sort of flirted with it when I was, at that time, because there was just too many, like not just from the families that I lived with, but say my friends and stuff in school would never sort of accept that. So I kind of didn't fall into it completely. It wasn't again until I was a young man, and again I sort of got back into this community where I sort of explored it again, and found during the course of that whereas I had been horribly rejected my whole life, right up to being a young man, that I was like embraced and I was brought in, and suddenly I was the darling star, right? I found that I had sort of certain qualities that these men lusted after, and they showered me with all of this positive attention. And that's when I began sort of there was the one place where there was a female in the house, and I was playing with her clothes and stuff when I was there, and they said, "Oh, do you like to do that?" And I sort of said, "Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do." And I started following down that road, and they said, "Well, you can just sort of go right ahead and do whatever you feel like around us. That's okay, right?" So I began sort of doing that around them, and because there was like a network there, I started encountering other males who were into that scene, and I became very popular with a lot of these guys, and some of these guys started offering me money, and that is when the whole sort of prostitution thing started, right? Because I'd have, 3 or 4 guys who were interested in me, and one's waving, $200-300 in my face, right? So I began playing with it at that time. But again, just like my transgender identity, that sort of exploration into prostitution was back and forth, right all the way through my life. But again, I think I had, any way you sort of spell it, I always had sort of an understanding of physical reality, and I knew that I was not and could never be a woman. I knew that this was a sort of a psychological, almost like It's like a role. Like all of us, I would say all of us to a certain degree sort of construct personalities that we present to the world, right? So we're all kind of role players to a certain extent. And I would say that transgender identity is much along the same lines. And coming up to getting involved in this, so I had been, doing this off and on for my life. I was in a place where I was sort of feeling more comfortable just doing whatever, and I didn't really worry about it. And I thought that the world had changed so much that I could actually go out to the casino, for instance, dressed like this or even sort of more sort of risque, and nobody would bother me, right? Nobody would harass me. In fact, I'd be quite popular. So I thought things were in a good place for what we'll call transgender people at that time. And I became aware one day, or was made aware in the casino by somebody, of Bill C-16, which is a piece of legislation in Canada that was being tabled at that time to protect transgender people. And this person had said to me, are you going to start using the women's washrooms and stuff now? Because I've never used the women's washrooms, right? I just walk right into the men's room because I've never had a problem. And I think it's highly inappropriate for me to even think about going into the women's washroom because I'm not a woman, right? So I've always used the men's facilities. And this guy was saying, are you going to start using the women's facilities now that they're putting through Bill C-16, which I didn't even know what it was at that time. I wasn't following the whole political thing. And I was like, okay, what are you talking about? No, I'm not going to start using the women's washrooms. But that got me curious, and so I looked into what was going on with Bill C-16. I would say much of my early impressions of what was going on with Bill C-16 have turned out to be sort of incorrect. It's not quite as draconian as it first appeared, but it seemed to be setting up a system of legislation that could be used to sort of force people to surrender reality and trample women's rights and stuff in the process. So I decided when I saw all of this stuff and when I researched it further in terms of what was being promoted in the culture with RuPaul and with Jazz Jennings and some of these shows out there, and this sort of saturation and the whole discussion that was going on. And when I saw what was going on, being somebody with a political background in propaganda and mass mind manipulation, if you will, I became alarmed. And I said, okay, in this instance, I believe the establishment has gone too far. Okay, they're completely out of line. I didn't see anybody in Canada that was significantly addressing this as a transgender person saying, wait a second, this is all crazy. So I decided that I had to get involved at that time, and I did. And I came in very sort of trepidatiously in the sense that I didn't know, okay, how do I come into this? How do I sort of portray myself, because I had come out of sex work, so I was used to at that time sort of presenting myself in a very sort of hyper feminine, sexualized way, right? But I only did that when I was interacting with males and stuff. But generally, like when I was out around town, I was more like you see me now, sort of more androgynous and what I'd call more edgy fashion type stuff. But when I came in, I wasn't sure, okay, what part of myself do I play up here? But, how am I going to be most accepted, and how can I get into this debate? So it's taken me some time to just sort of go, okay, I'm not going to worry about, how I present to society. I'm just going to be myself, come in, attack some of this nonsense, and see where it goes. But my primary concern when I came in was the trampling of women's rights, right? So the fact that women's safe spaces and private spaces were being invaded by men claiming to be women, and also what they were doing in schools. Okay, because at that time, SOGI 123 was just being implemented in British Columbia, which is what I would call a brainwashing program in our schools that is romancing young, confused kids and making them question their gender identity. And when I saw that, I was like, okay, so this is like the Nazi youth, these types of brainwashing programs that you see in schools and stuff. So those were my primary two concerns. That's how I got into it. And of course, once I stepped in as a transgender person, almost immediately I was besieged. Like I was just sort of swarmed by people from the LGBTQ community who first and foremost, the first thing they did was question my identity as transgender. Okay. This is the respect identity crowd, right? And so the first thing they did.
Wait, repeat that, because that you can't get any more key than this. Go ahead and
so
repeat that.
The whole sort of thing with the transgender rights movement is that we need to respect identity, right? You need to, if somebody says that their identity is this, you need to respect that, right? But when I came in and said, well, I think that identity is fine, but you need to sort of accept physical reality, then the whole transgender radical activism stuff descended upon me and said, you're not really transgender. So they rejected my identity and they said, you're just a sex pervert and you've got no right to talk. And they just, that went on and on for, I think it probably took a good year and a half in the trenches before they finally started saying, okay, well, maybe Jenn is transgender, but Jenn is, evil or something. But
okay, well, and that is so key, Jenn, because as you and I, having met, coming from different places, but having arrived at the same kind of conclusions, hence our concerns are the same. You have, and you were probably addressing this before I was, but it became clear to me. And so you have actually written a paper, I'm going to be reading it, on the Synanon cult, the parallels, and I've been speaking about that what looks like, and all the PR talking points about the concern for kids, and here, as you've just said, you talk about your own experience, and all of a sudden you're besieged with those that supposedly have that are the most sensitive and accepting of anyone. They descend upon you. Now they descended upon you, right? So claiming you're not legitimate, you're not, yeah. Right? And they became mean and nasty. And then I, of course, have received the same thing, but for different reasons. So it's very interesting that when you start to peel back the layers of this, if this were simply a movement that cares about kids, vulnerable kids, confused kids, they would be the most receptive to anybody's perspective.
Right. Yeah, and especially somebody like me, okay, because they know my background. Okay, so they know that I was in foster homes and stuff, and that I came out into the adult world this wounded creature, right? So they know that I've got this background, and they're supposed to be all about toleration, love, and inclusion, right? And they showered me with intolerance, hatred, and exclusion, stripped me of my identity. So that tells you that they're not really about those things. They're about control, or controlling the narrative and pushing an agenda.
We'll have to interrupt the interview at this point, but join us for part 2, as Jenn Smith will describe what happened when he decided to speak out against those who would seek to exploit vulnerable, gender-confused young people, those who would seek to subject them to cross-sex hormones for nefarious agendas and for profits. I'm John Euler, and thank you for listening to Survivor Support's Predator Watch podcast.
You've been listening to Predator Watch, dedicated to shining the light of truth about the nature of the most sophisticated of sexual predators most likely to target places where victims are most easily accessed. For John Euler and the entire team, thanks for listening.
Predator Watch has been sponsored by SurvivorSupport.net. As a non-profit organization, Survivor Support is dependent upon the generosity of people who believe in its mission of supporting survivors. Please consider becoming a monthly supporter of this important work.